Well, good evening, everyone. We're so glad you came out tonight. I think many of you are about as ready to get rid of this ice and snow as I am. And I don't know whether that spurred your attendance here tonight. I know it gave you a good reason to come out and learn more about our city and our state's Civil War history. We're so glad that you're here. My name's Stephen McAteer. As many of you know, I'm the director here at the museum. And tonight's presentation is a great partnership we have with the Civil War Roundtable of Arkansas. Lonnie, did I get it right? The Civil War Roundtable of Arkansas. Great. They're great partners with us, and we appreciate them. We're so glad that you're here tonight. I was telling my staff, tonight we have an opportunity. I have a saying that I use a lot that they make fun of me on, but it's a sense of place, and it's a sense of history. And tonight we're going to provide you, through our speaker and his expertise, a sense of place for this building, these grounds, this city, and what was happening 165 years ago, this very date and the days preceding and following this date, February the 3rd in 1861. And I'm not going to try to steal any of your thunder, but just to set the stage, 165 years ago, Little Rock was in a state of dis-ease and uncertainty. It had just seen the election of a man to president without getting a single Southern electoral vote in the months prior to this event, followed by the immediate secession of 7 fellow Southern states, the uncertainty of an election that was coming in less than 2 weeks about what Arkansas should do. And then in the middle of all that, set this building, part of the Little Rock Arsenal, a federal military post. And as more importantly than that, in this building were the weapons that were assigned to the state of Arkansas. So what could go wrong? Well, we're going to learn about tonight from our guest, and it's my pleasure to introduce him. Dr. David Sesser is an associate professor of library science. He serves as the director of Sims Memorial Library at Southeastern Louisiana University. He had quite a ways to get here. He came up yesterday, and we've enjoyed getting to know him more in the time that he came this morning. He previously held roles. He's not a stranger to our state. He previously held roles at Henderson State University, including acting library director, director of the Museum Studies program, and university historian. His work has appeared in multiple publications, including the Southeastern Librarian and the Encyclopedia of Arkansas. Go Encyclopedia of Arkansas. A great source of history. If you are not familiar with that website, go to it. Additionally, he has authored 2 books, one of which we're very proud to have you be associated with, The Little Rock Arsenal Crisis, on the precipice of the American Civil War, as well as The School with a Heart, Henderson State University at 125. The Arkansas Historical Association recognized him in 2021 as the recipient of the Walter L. Brown County and Local Government Award for Best Edited Document for his manuscript, We Saw a Beautiful Town, Union Soldiers' Impressions of Arkadelphia during the Camden Expedition, another Civil War expedition that we're quite familiar with here at the museum. Please join me in welcoming Dr. David Sesser.
Well, thank you so much for inviting me tonight. I bring Mardi Gras greetings from South Louisiana. We were closed one day because it got a little cold, and that was it. So it is always good to be home in Arkansas. My wife and son are both native Arkansans. I am not. I was born and raised in Natchez, Mississippi, but I got here as soon as I could when I turned 18, and I lived in Arkadelphia for 20 years and have been in South Louisiana for 3, but it is always good to be back home. So tonight we're going to talk a little bit about the Arsenal crisis. Now, there's probably a wide range of knowledge in this room about the Arsenal crisis, about Arkansas in 1861, about the Civil War in Arkansas. I practiced this presentation with my librarians in South Louisiana because I'm their boss. I told them to come and they did. And they had great questions, but I had to explain some pretty basic things about Arkansas history. And they were flabbergasted because as corrupt as Louisiana is, Arkansas in the 1860s is giving it a pretty good run for its money. So tonight we're going to talk about the impact of both politics and technology. And when I talk about the technology part, you'll probably think, oh, that's not very technologically advanced. But for the time, it was. I always like to start with this image. This is my favorite image of this building. This was taken in 1934, in April of 1934, part of a New Deal project to take photographs of historic buildings across the country. This photo is from the Library of Congress. So, a little bit about the Arsenal crisis. What came about? Why did it come about? What were these different competing ideas, notions, events, and how did they all come together as one and force this crisis? Well, first, you have the newly elected governor, Governor Henry Rector, probably one of the most inept and worst governors the state has ever seen, even though there are a few others who are giving him a run for his money. Then we have the election of President Lincoln, as Stephen mentioned, elected in the same year that Rector was elected, but at different times. And then the technology part, the installation of the telegraph system, cutting edge technology in 1861 finally reaches Little Rock. So there were multiple elections in 1860. You had the state elections. You also had the federal elections. Rector was elected in August to the office of governor. He took office in November the 15th. So it's very important. There's a lot of events going on, and it's important to kind of remember the chronological order of everything that's going on because there are things that overlap as well. So you have Rector elected August, takes office in November. 9 days before he's elected, or before he takes office, Abraham Lincoln is elected governor. Now, Stephen said, elected president, Stephen said, of course, Lincoln didn't receive any Southern electoral votes. How many popular votes did he receive in Arkansas? Zero. Any in Louisiana? Zero. Mississippi? Zero. Because, of course, he wasn't, quote unquote, on the ballot in those states. Breckinridge won Arkansas, the then current vice president of the United States, who went on to become a Confederate general. So Rector is elected. He's not a popular governor. He just kind of falls into the position due to several different events going on and the unpopularity of his opponent. So this is Rector. This is well after his time in office in Arkansas. So just a little bit about Rector. He moved to Arkansas as a child. His father had the original land patent to what is now downtown Hot Springs, including the hot springs. And the federal government eventually made that land patent invalid and took the property, which is now Hot Springs National Park. And Rector spent a large part of his adult life fighting against the federal government to regain that land. He was obviously unsuccessful. Held a lot of different jobs in Arkansas. He married into the family, but he was not really that well known, very popular. He served as a U.S. Marshal. He served 2 terms in the state Senate. He served a term in the state House. And he served for a very brief window on the state Supreme Court before he was removed because his decisions were, quote unquote, completely inept. So that was in 1859. He was elected to the state Supreme Court. So he served, maybe a year or so. In 1860, he decides, even though I'm a member of the family which of course controlled all Arkansas politics from the territorial days up until that point, he decides, I'm no longer part of that family. I'm going to run as a quote unquote independent Democrat. What's an independent Democrat? Nobody knows, because he was the first one. He made it up. So he runs against Richard Mentor Johnson, who was the family candidate for the governor's race. Johnson was a terrible, terrible campaigner. He would get up, speak before a crowd, and he would lose votes. Rector, on the other hand, he was pretty savvy. He would get up in front of a crowd, and one of the things he said is, I believe in free public education for all white children. And some people point out to him, that means a massive increase in taxes. So the next time he gets up and says, I do not support any public education at all for any white children. Everybody needs to pay their own way. So it's really hard to nail him down on different issues. And he kind of rode that confusion to a win. He won by about 4.7% of the above Johnson. So, of course, he's elected in August. He's going to take office in November. So when he does take office, he needs to work with the General Assembly. Now, even though he is a quote-unquote independent Democrat, the legislature, the General Assembly, is still controlled by the family. Not 100%, but they obviously are running things behind the show. So Rector decides he needs an issue. He needs to coalesce the General Assembly behind him so he can get his platform pushed through. He picks secession as his issue. He thinks it's a winning issue. He is a planter. He has a plantation in Pulaski County, and of course he has other land in what is today Garland County, and then elsewhere in the state as well. But he just decides that is going to be the winning issue for him. First, the General Assembly needs to elect a new senator, because of course at this time senators representing the states, the state legislatures appointed or approved the senators. Rector's candidate was the only one who openly supported secession. That candidate goes down in flames. So after a month of constantly lobbying the House and the Senate, he finally gets the House in December of 1860 to pass a bill calling for secession convention. So obviously not calling for secession, but let's perhaps have a convention to talk about the issue of leaving the Union. The Senate took their time, and it was about a month later, it was in January of 1861, that the Senate passed their bill. So the bill actually put 2 questions in front of the voters. First, should we have a secession convention? And then second, if we do have a secession convention, who's going to represent your county? It is scheduled for February the 18th, 1861. So keep that date in mind, February the 18th, 15 days from today. So this is just a list of all the southern states and when they seceded. Obviously, with Lincoln's election, South Carolina didn't wait. They went in December of 60, followed closely, unfortunately, by my home state, and then you can see the others. Now, what's interesting about all these states is they're what we call Deep South states. Arkansas is not a Deep South state. part of the Upper South. Of course, do we have parts that are closely identified with the Deep South? Yes. Eastern Arkansas, Southern Arkansas, places where there are large numbers of plantation, large numbers of enslaved people who are working on those plantations. But you have got to remember Upland, Arkansas. You've got to remember Little Rock. Little Rock is a somewhat cosmopolitan city at this point. It's no New Orleans, but it is a city where there are relatively few enslaved people, and those that are here are working mostly in skilled labor, or they're house servants or things like that. We don't have large-scale plantations in this immediate vicinity. So a little bit about the arsenal at this point. It is this building, as well as I think 26 other structures at that time. There's a great model downstairs on the first floor of all the buildings, and they're numbered, and there's a key, and it'll show you what each building was. Now, of course, we're in the last remaining building of the arsenal. At this time, the arsenal was pretty much completely unstaffed. There were a few caretakers that were members of the United States Ordnance Corps. So the War Department decided, Arkansas is a southern state. They have a governor who's calling for a secession convention. Maybe we should put some troops at the arsenal, where we have all those weapons. So they sent a Battery F of the 2nd United States Artillery. They were in Fort Smith. They came down the Arkansas River. They arrived in December of 1860. So their commander is Captain James Totten. His father was a physician here in Little Rock. He actually left his men. He came down by himself, and he started going to Christmas parties and hanging out, and was the debutante in the city. Very popular, having a good time. The battery arrived on December 6th, obviously at the riverfront, marched here to the arsenal. So there were 76 men of the battery, and so there were about 14 more here as part of the Ordnance Department. So we only have 90 men at this federal military post in a southern city. And so that's Totten. That's him at the end of the war when he was a brevet brigadier general. So this is an arsenal. We all kind of know what an arsenal is. It's a place where you keep guns and weapons and ammunition and all kinds of things like that. But why was it important? Why was it here in Little Rock? Little Rock had been a state by 1861 for 25 years. Our 25th anniversary joining the Union would have been later on in 1861. We didn't quite hit it. But they had weapons here for the people of Arkansas to use as needed. And these are the numbers of the weapons. So 1,300 percussion small arms, which are the cutting edge weapons of the day. And then an additional 54 rifles, 1,300 smoothbore muskets. They had flintlocks, handguns, edge weapons, things like that, that we're not exactly sure how much ammunition, things like that they had. There was a report done around the time Totten and his men arrived that had exactly was held at the arsenal. They didn't bother counting these things. And then there were also 4 pieces of field artillery. It's important to remember that Totten's men were artillerymen. They were trained to use field pieces. They did not bring these with them. They were already here at the arsenal, so they were going to use them here if they needed to. So what we have is a war of words that breaks out between the governor, Rector, and Captain Totten. And the thing is, we have all of this correspondence that goes back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. It's in the official records of the War of the Rebellion. It's also in my book in an appendix. So it's very formal as well. I'm sure a lot of you have read Civil War correspondence, official reports. It's not a John Edwards talking about Shelby, which they just make things up, but they do speak in a way that we don't anymore. So this is the first bit. I'm not going to obviously read all that. You can read it, but Rector is telling Totten that the people shall have determined to sever their connection with the general government. So don't send any additional forces to the arsenal, and don't attempt to remove or destroy any of the munitions at the arsenal. It's kind of a weird thing for the governor to tell a federal military officer. He also, in this correspondence, said that it was up to Totten to quiet the public mind and prevent a collision between the sovereign people of Arkansas and the Union troops stationed here. Why would it be up to Totten to prevent civilians in Arkansas from taking the arsenal? It's very important to remember. A lot of people gloss over this fact. Arkansas was part of the United States. This is America. Right then, at that time, February of 1861, Arkansas had not even had the vote to call a secession convention, much less a secession convention to leave the Union. So Totten writes his replies. Now, it's very well recorded, not verbatim what he would say, but Totten was well known for his ability to curse. And during the war, it was said that men would travel for miles around just to hear him curse out his own troops as he was training them to get them better. It was a motivator. You know, anyone who's been through boot camp knows that it is a very strong motivator. So on January 29th of 61, Totten makes very clear that he is an officer in the United States Army. He does not report to Henry Rector or anybody else in Arkansas. His direct supervisor is a guy named Colonel Samuel Cooper, the Adjutant General of the United States Army in Washington. So the few issues with the correspondence back and forth. Rector already thinks that Arkansas is going to leave the Union. He's been pushing this issue since he was elected. He thinks, now I finally got the General Assembly to call this vote. We're going to have the secession convention. The people are going to say, okay, we're going to go. So he already has this laid out in his mind. But it's important to remember that even though the weapons here are for the people of Arkansas, if they're needed, you know, they belong to the federal government, not the state of Arkansas. So at this time, we have a breakthrough in technology in Arkansas with the installation of the telegraph line. Up until this point, the telegraph line from Memphis ended in Des Arc. And then, of course, messages would have to travel by horseback down to Little Rock. With this installation, Little Rock is now connected to the entire eastern seaboard, which is a very big deal. My wife is from Devall's Bluff, so I always give her grief that Devall's Bluff was not the end of the telegraph line, Des Arc, the other county seat of Prairie County. So, in honor of this new telegraph line opening, they reach out to U.S. Attorney John M. Harrell, who was obviously the U.S. Attorney for the Buchanan administration here in Little Rock, sitting U.S. Attorney. And they said, hey, would you come up with some stuff just to share over the telegraph to let people know what's going on? in Arkansas. And he says, okay. And he thought about it for a while, and he composed some messages. And he composed quite a few different things to share. But one of the things he shared was a rumor that federal troops were coming from the Indian Territory, from Fort Gibson, to reinforce the arsenal. There's no evidence that any discussions were ever being held to that point. He just kind of made it up, or he heard it as a rumor from someone else. We're not really sure. It's very unclear. But this kind of opens a can of worms. So we already have the tension within Little Rock between Rector and Totten and all of the federal troops here at the arsenal. When the telegraph line opens, they also open it to other cities in Arkansas that are already connected to the telegraph line, including in eastern Arkansas, Helena. So Helena is full of people who are very pro-secession because, of course, it's the home of Thomas C. Heineman, the U.S. representative for the 1st District. He's a firebrand for secession. And in fact, he was involved with helping get Rector elected. He loaned his newspaper to Rector to print editorials and things like that in support of Rector's candidacy. So these people listened to those messages, and they immediately composed a response back to Little Rock saying, we offer 500 volunteers to come take control of the arsenal before those reinforcements can arrive from Fort Gibson. That's a problem because these are not actual troops. They are militia. They are somewhat trained, but they are not federal troops. There's no reason for them to be called out. Rector was very careful in his response, saying, I have no authority to summon you, but should the people assemble in their own defense, the governor will interpose his official position in their behalf. Saying, I'm not going to call you. It's up to you if you want to come, but if you do come, assemble in their own defense, I'll step in. I'll claim my official authority. What's very interesting is this is an offensive action. They are going to capture the arsenal. That is not a defensive action. So what happens? Oh, you start having armed people show up in the streets of Little Rock. Hundreds of volunteers from actually a wide number of communities across the state begin showing up here in Little Rock. So these are all the counties that are represented. So you have Phillips, Jefferson, Prairie, White, Monroe, which are all, in St. Francis, all eastern Arkansas, large planter population, large numbers of enslaved people. But you also have Hot Spring, Saline, and Montgomery. Hot Spring County has a few plantations, Saline a few. Montgomery, have anybody been to Mount Ida? You can't grow anything in Mount Ida. I mean, they sell rocks. That's how they make money. So another rumor passes through the town saying federal troops are coming up the Arkansas River, and it causes more militia to arrive in the city. And this is Patrick Claiborne. He commanded the Yale Rifles from Helena, who came here and participated. This is him in his uniform as a major general in the Confederate Army. He was a native of Ireland, served in the British Army, worked in Helena for a druggist, was a friend, acquaintance of Thomas C. Heineman, things like that. But because of his military experience in the British Army, he was the commander of the Yale Rifles. So this is an 1860 map of Arkansas. So I can get that. Okay. So St. Francis County, Monroe County, Arkansas County, Prairie, all this, these are the areas where most of the troops came from. You've got Montgomery, you've got Hot Spring, and you've got Saline right here. Very interesting. Now, of course, Rector was a poor farmer from Saline County. So that might have been part of why the Saline County guys showed up. But it's kind of an issue. We know why the people in eastern Arkansas showed up. Maybe it was state pride. Maybe not really sure. Not a lot of recordings on why all of these men showed up. So you've got armed men in the streets of Little Rock. What do? Well, there's not really a city police force, so you petition your local government, which is the Little Rock City Council. So on February 5th, they call on a resolution saying, hey, Governor, you need to clarify your role in this situation because it is not clear. These guys are just walking around. They are semi-trained, but they're not doing anything that requires training right now. What's going to happen? The same day, they passed another resolution again. So these two resolutions are pretty similar. So I'm thinking there were multiple politicians on the city council that wanted their own version to go to the governor and hopefully clarify the situation. The next day, they passed another resolution. So in 2 days, 3 resolutions. This one calls on the governor to say, this is what's happening. This is over. This is the end of it. Now, Albert Pike comes into this. He's not really active in this part of the story, but the background is important to know. Because we have the deployment of the Capitol Guards. So the Capitol Guards are the militia unit for Little Rock. And there used to be a monument out here for the Capitol Guards when they served as Company A of the 6th Arkansas during the Civil War. The Capitol Guards before the war, and actually, let me start over. The Capitol Guards during the Mexican-American War served in the Arkansas Mounted Riflemen. They were a company under the command of Albert Pike. They were the best trained unit, best trained company within that regiment. So they were pulled out and they served with regular federal forces for much of the Mexican-American War. The Little Rock City Council called out the then present day Capitol Guards on February the 6th. So many of the leading men in the community obviously were members of this. Albert Pike commanded them during the Mexican War. Now, they were so well trained, it caused some problems in the Arkansas Mounted Riflemen during the war. This is the best part of this. With men with guns walking around downtown Little Rock, the Capitol Guard surrounded the State House, which is now the old State House, which is where most of these men were camped, and kept them at the old State House rather than protecting the arsenal. Because not only were these men carrying around weapons, they're also drinking quite a bit. So during the Mexican-American War, Albert Pike commanded the Capitol Guards at I'm trying to put this as delicately as possible. The Arkansans were terrible in the Mexican-American War, the Arkansas Regiment. Governor Yell, who was then the colonel of the regiment, was killed. Many were captured, many were killed, and Albert Pike wrote some editorials, wrote some reports about what was going on in the Mexican-American War, which caused bad blood between the Capitol Guards and the rest of the Arkansans. Now, remember, we're talking about this is 15 years later. So most of those people are no longer in these militia units, but those tensions still simmer because, of course, the Capitol Guards are still the Little Rock militia. Conversations continue between Rector and Totten. I mean, this is a constant back and forth, back and forth. But Rector is not claiming to be in control of these troops at this point. He's saying, hey, they just showed up. These people are spontaneously coming to Little Rock because of what they heard over the telegraph. They might capture the arsenal. They might not. I have nothing to do with it. Totten, on the other hand, is constantly reaching out to Washington saying, what do I do? I need instructions. He's a captain. That is a company grade officer. And he is trying to deal with this situation. That is well above his pay grade. Well, the problem is it's going to Samuel Cooper. Samuel Cooper resigned his commission and became a Confederate general. So it's also important to remember that this was not only happening in Little Rock, it was happening at the Alamo in Texas, which was a federal arsenal. David Twiggs was the federal commander there, and he eventually surrendered in early February to Texas state forces and gave them the keys to the Alamo, basically, with all the weapons inside. Samuel Cooper kicked David Twiggs out of the Army over that. And then they both ended up as generals in the Confederate Army, which is very strange. Every arsenal in the South is falling. The Augusta Arsenal in Georgia. In Baton Rouge, they have the Pentagon Barracks that fell. There's multiple forts south of New Orleans that were taken. There were very few troops at any of these posts. At one of the forts outside New Orleans, Louisiana volunteers showed up and said, we're capturing the fort. And it was the caretaker, his wife, and their kids. That was it. And they said, okay, here you go. Here are the keys. So finally, Rector decides, okay, I've got to take control of the situation. It has spiraled out of control. He appoints Governor John Selden Roane as the acting commander of the militia units in Little Rock. With that, Rector is saying, okay, these are now official state militia units. We can command them to do what we need to do. Now, remember the Arkansas unit in the Mexican-American War. Colonel Yell was killed. John Selden Roane was the lieutenant colonel of that regiment. He is the senior surviving officer of the Arkansas regiment during the Mexican-American War. Albert Pike did not like John Selden Roane, and John Selden Roane did not like Albert Pike. So in all the criticisms that Albert Pike levied against the Arkansas regiment, John Selden Roane was the only one who could respond because, of course, Colonel Yell is dead, which later led to a duel fought on a sandbar in the Arkansas River out by Fort Smith, which ended in a draw because obviously they're both still alive at this point. But there's no love lost between these men. And then that's John Selden Roane. So finally, Rector has these troops. Totten realizes, I'm not getting any answers. It's not that he was receiving unclear communications from Washington or communications of hold on and we'll get some troops to you or anything like that. He received no communication at all from Washington. He was completely on his own. He decided he needed to surrender. So Roane's in command. Rector orders 2 companies to march on the arsenal. Now, since Rector and Roane are now in command of the militia, that kind of nullifies the Capitol Guards because the city council called out the Capitol Guards. So you have the state government and the city government. Capitol Guards just had to let them march on the arsenal. So it was formally surrendered at 3 o'clock on February the 8th, 1861. It took them a while. They did a complete inventory with multiple copies of that inventory list between militia officers and Totten's officers. He was a captain. He had 2 lieutenants here with him, first lieutenant and a second lieutenant. So this is key. Totten did not surrender the post. He did not surrender the weapons to the state of Arkansas. He gave them in trust to Rector personally until Arkansas decided to leave the Union or until they decided to come back, whatever the ultimate end was. It was very unclear at that point, obviously. Because remember, this is February 8th, 10 days before the popular vote to see whether or not we were going to have a secession convention, and if we did, who would represent the voters. So the federal troops here did evacuate the arsenal. They marched to the Arkansas River, where they camped for 4 days. Because this happened so quickly, Totten did not have time to arrange transportation for his men. Finally, they put them on a steamboat, sent them to St. Louis. So it's well known that while they were at the river waiting for transportation, a group of Little Rock women gave Totten a sword, which he promised that he would only bear in the defense of his country always, when right, and never in any land or against any people on the side of wrong, injustice, oppression, or their constitutional rights. Well, that's a bit of foreshadowing. So 10 days later, that was the vote. So 27,000 in support of a convention, 15,000 in opposition. So it's obviously clear that the voters of Arkansas want to have a secession convention. But what's also clear are that Unionist candidates won a clear majority, 6,000 more votes than the pro-secession candidates. So obviously the people want to discuss this, but they're not interested in immediately leaving the Union. They're not like South Carolina, where the legislature just decided to do it, anything like that. If we're going to leave the Union, we're going to take our time, we're going to talk about it, we're going to discuss it. And the secession convention met March 4th, met for about 2 weeks. And then they decided, we're not going to make this decision. We're going to send it back to the voters in August. You know, that's pretty good idea. But things changed with the firing of Fort Sumter, April 12th. So, of course, Arkansas is still part of the Union, obviously, because the secession convention has not voted to leave the Union. President Lincoln called for 75,000 volunteers to put down the rebellion, and he requested Arkansas furnish a specific number. Does anybody know? 780. 780. It was based on our population. So obviously New York, Pennsylvania, they were supposed to provide quite a few more. That was not welcomed by the people of Arkansas. Well, by many of the people of Arkansas, let's put it that way. It reignited the secession issue because the convention is not in session at this point. So they reconvened on May 6th. First, they put out a proposal to go ahead and send it to the voters. That was shot down. And then they voted to leave the Union with, of course, Isaac Murphy being the only delegate to vote against it. So with the evacuation of the arsenal, these were not the last federal troops in the state. They first evacuated the 3 forts in the Indian Territory, which is interesting because you would think they would evacuate from Arkansas first, but the 3 federal forts in the Indian Territory were they all received supplies from Fort Smith. So if Fort Smith fell, they would be starved out. So they all evacuated into Kansas. And then, of course, federal troops evacuated Fort Smith on April 23rd. And Arkansas volunteers arrived that same day. Interesting, Solon Borland was the major of the Arkansas Regiment during the Mexican-American War. So you have the surviving lieutenant colonel and the surviving major involved in this, as well as the Capitol Guards that served under Albert Pike. So you've got a lot of Mexican War connections to this period. And with that, there are no more federal troops in Arkansas for about not quite a year, because of course in the spring of '62 they're back in North Arkansas. This is very strange because we are still part of the United States. So just a little background, what happened to some of these people? Well, Henry Rector, when Arkansas joined the Confederacy, of course, they adopted a new constitution, but they changed the governor's term from 4 years to 2. Well, he was our first 2-year governor. And of course, you know, that remained up until through Bill Clinton's time. He did serve in the Arkansas militia during the war as a private. And then he worked as a planter and landlord and continued to sue the federal government for the rest of his life for his dad's property. James Totten, he served. He was a brevet brigadier general at the end of the war, commanding the artillery at Mobile at the end of the war. But he was cashiered out of the Army. He was a lieutenant colonel in 1870. He was drunk. So maybe that had something to do with all the cursing. But and he died shortly after that. He's buried in Missouri. So James Harrell, remember, he was the U.S. attorney who wrote the telegraph that kind of got this ball rolling. He served in the Confederate Army, and he wrote a Confederate military history of Arkansas. So every state of the Confederacy has a volume in this set. Arkansas and Florida's, our volumes are combined in one. And he wrote that, and he makes himself look great in that book. And of course, Pat Claiborne became a major general in the Confederate Army, commanded division, and he was killed at the Battle of Franklin in November of '64. So why are we talking about this event? I mean, it happened 165 years ago this week, really. The war didn't start here. Thank God for South Carolina. You know, why is it important? So it is a great example of how confusing everything was at this time. You've got multiple elections, the state elections, the presidential elections. You've got the installation of the telegraph line to Little Rock, connecting us to the wider outside world. You've got the people of Little Rock, city people, tradespeople in the Little Rock Capitol Guards facing off against the sons of planters from eastern Arkansas, all armed to the teeth, all drinking heavily. Nobody knows what's going to happen. You have a governor who's grasping at straws, trying to get some power. You have a captain in the United States Army who cannot get his commander to tell him, this is what you need to do. Nobody knew what was going to happen next. It is just through sheer luck that the shooting war did not begin here. And I am, for one, thankful that it did not begin in Arkansas, because we don't want to be known as the place where the Civil War started. So, of course, all the images are from the EOA in the Library of Congress. Thank you. Thank you.